Hi, my name is Julie Byrne, and I'm a solutions architect at GitLab. Today, I'd like to talk about considerations for migrating from a self-managed GitLab instance to our GitLab SaaS platform, or GitLab.com. There is a variety of reasons why a customer would potentially want to move from a self-managed instance that they're currently maintaining to GitLab.com. First of all, the removal of the administrative overhead is beneficial to customers. They no longer have to do their own backup and restore and upgrade process. And they will get automatic rollout of new features on the 22nd of every month as GitLab releases its latest features. There's also shared GitLab runner minutes available on GitLab.com, so that removes some of the overhead of maintaining GitLab runners. But when we're talking to customers about migrating from self-managed to GitLab.com, we want to make sure that they have all of the information they need so that they can handle the migration in the most appropriate and least intrusive fashion for their development teams. We do have a professional services offering that allows customers to utilize our professional services team for the migration of data to the GitLab.com instance from self-managed, or customers can choose to do the migration themselves. There are certainly benefits of using our professional services team. They have done hundreds of migrations to GitLab SaaS over many years at this point, and they help with the upfront planning and expectation setting with end users and make sure that you have as smooth an experience as possible when getting your data over to SaaS. But we do have customers who migrate the data themselves as well. And there's some newer functionality with GitLab Group Direct Transfer that allows our customers to more easily migrate a group or set of groups and all of the subgroups and projects underneath it over to the SaaS instance without needing an admin token or writing scripts or doing the migrations, one by one, project by project. And I want to take you through that functionality today and through that process of the migration itself. It's important to note, though, that whether you decide to use professional services or you do the migration yourself as a customer, there's still going to be some limitations in the data that gets migrated from your self-managed instance to your SaaS instance. And we do have a feature matrix that lays out what data gets migrated versus not for a do-it-yourself UI-based migration versus a GitLab professional services migration with our automated tooling called Congregate. So there's a link to that documentation as well as all the other important documentation that you'll need in this presentation, and the link to this presentation will be included in the description of the video. Before a customer goes ahead and starts to move all of their data to GitLab.com, we want to make sure that they are adequately preparing for the migration itself. There is some pre-work that needs to be done to make sure that once you get your data to GitLab SaaS, that you can use your projects in the same way that you were using them on self-managed or as close to that as possible. Now, there are some differences between the feature set on self-managed versus SaaS, so it's important that you familiarize yourself with those differences. A couple of the major differences, this is not an exhaustive list, but you do want to make sure that you familiarize yourself with all of the differences, but the most important ones that we want to point out up front are the project types. Public projects on SaaS would be public to the entire internet, whereas a public project in a self-managed instance that's locked behind your firewall would only be accessible to your organization. So you probably want to change, in most cases, your public projects to private before migrating them to SaaS. Additionally, there's no internal project type on SaaS, so any internal projects that get migrated to SaaS will automatically be converted to private projects. With the GitLab SaaS instance, there is no LDAP integration available. So on SaaS, typically our customers will use SAML SSO integration for GitLab.com groups. That will allow you to manage user creation as well as authentication of those users. And with SAML groupsync, you can manage permissions of users in appropriate groups on your GitLab instance as well. Now, on our SaaS instance, it's a multi-tenant SaaS instance, so no customer has any access to an admin console. There's no administrator capabilities like you would have on a self-managed GitLab instance. And there's no access to the file system. So if you have, for example, server-side Git hooks, you cannot have those on the SaaS instance. So if you're moving from self-managed to SaaS and you want to use some similar functionality, we recommend that you check out push rules and or webhooks. You can also tie a bunch of actions into your GitLab CI if you need to by making some additional calls as CI jobs to do whatever actions you're typically doing with hooks. So that's another option that you have. The next thing you want to do is review your project sizes. Now, project size is a bit misleading because on self-managed, there are things like unexpired job artifacts that tend to bloat your project size. Job artifacts is one example of data that doesn't get migrated over to SaaS. So we don't really care about having many job artifacts laying around, making your project size big. But generally speaking, when the GitLab UI group migration happens, behind the scenes, a project export file for every project is being utilized. And that project export file cannot be larger than 10 gigabytes. So we do want to make sure that your projects are sufficiently sized that export file that's used behind the scenes will not be bigger than 10 gigabytes for any project that you want to migrate to SaaS. As a proxy to get an idea of how big your export file is going to be, we recommend that you utilize the repository size because typically that's the bulk of the data that causes a project to be large in terms of the export file size. So if you go through your project list and look for repositories that are bigger than 10 gigabytes, you will want to use our documented processes for going ahead and cleaning up and trying to reduce the size of those repositories. Now, there are some other cases where a project might get very large, whether you have thousands and thousands or tens of thousands of issues, or you have tens of thousands of historical pipelines. In those cases, we have a utility called Evaluate that you can use. It's source available to anybody who wants to use it, that you can run across all of your projects on the self-managed instance, and it will flag the different cases of large data sets that might cause the project export file to be larger than 10 gigabytes. And we're only going to have an issue with a project if that export file ends up being 10 gigabytes or more. So that utility is going to be helpful to use to get an idea of what might need to be cleaned up before you start migrating your groups and projects to SaaS. And then you'll want to review your runner strategy if you do want to take advantage of the GitLab.com shared runner minutes. If you're using all private runners today, you want to understand which jobs need to happen with a runner that's behind your firewall. Maybe you're deploying to an environment in your data center that needs a runner behind your firewall to do, and which types of jobs are straightforward, simple, short running jobs that you can take advantage of the GitLab shared runners for. If you're going to use the combination of both shared runners and private runners, you do want to make sure that you are setting the appropriate tags on your private runners and setting those tags in your jobs so that as the jobs are being processed on GitLab.com, you're using the shared runners for the appropriate jobs and then the private runners for jobs that need those private runners. You also need to re-register the private runners as you're doing your migration to SaaS. So you can register them all at your top level namespace, and they can be registered to both your self-managed and your SaaS instance at the same time, or you can wait and migrate the data and then register your private runners to the specific subgroups who might use them. The next step we would recommend is to make sure that you have a solid plan for any data that does not get automatically migrated that you will need to migrate, or you'll need to reconfigure manually after the migration happens. So any secrets, any access tokens, personal group or project, deploy tokens, those are not going to get migrated as part of the automated migration process. Similarly, group and project level variables do not get migrated. There are other data types that don't get migrated as well, but these are the most important ones that tend to trip customers up. So I like to point these out, but please do review the list of features that get migrated versus not, and review your projects to make sure you have a solid plan for how you're going to update your projects manually post-migration so that they run appropriately in your GitLab SaaS instance. Similarly, there are other updates you might need to make. As an example, any full URL references to a GitLab group or project, whether it's a CI template that's being referred to in a CI file, or maybe it's referred to via a webhook or an integration, you're going to need to update those to the new URL references, so gitlab.com group and project, once the project is migrated. And then finally, before you can start migrating data, you do need to have your own namespace set up for your organization on gitlab.com. Generally speaking, that just means that you need to go into gitlab.com, create a new group that has the name of the organization that you want to use for production purposes, and then work with your account team to make sure that you get the appropriate license tier applied to that namespace. It's always better to have the same tier license applied to both your self-managed and your gitlab.com namespace, if at all possible. So here are the steps that we need to take in order to migrate data. So I'm going to talk about users on gitlab.com first, because that tends to trip people up when they're not familiar with gitlab.com, new to it, or forget about the users before starting to migrate data. So we do want to work through that first. Then we need to also make sure that gitlab.com can reach out and communicate with and pull data from your GitLab self-managed instance. So we'll talk about what's needed there. We'll go through the group import option, the group direct transfer option, I believe it's called. Again, that's pretty new functionality that allows you to migrate one or more groups from your self-managed instance with all their subgroups and projects all at one time. So I'll take you through that process. And then in case you have any straggler projects, whether they're in a personal namespace or whatever the case may be, you may have projects that you want to migrate one at a time instead of migrating as part of a larger group migration. So I'll take you through how to use the GitLab project export file to export your data from one GitLab instance for a single project, and then use that export file to import that project into gitlab.com. And then finally, we'll talk about the recreation of additional data after you migrate your projects using the automated tooling in the UI. So let's first talk about users on gitlab.com. When you set up users on gitlab.com, GitLab.com, remember, it's a multi-tenant instance. We have multiple customers on it, and we have users using it for their own private purposes in their own private namespaces. So your existing enterprise users may or may not already have an enterprise account on GitLab.com. In order to get the appropriate historical representation of things like owners and commenters on merge requests and issues, you're going to want to make sure that all of the users that are in your self-managed instance have accounts on gitlab.com, and the email address of their gitlab.com account, the primary email, matches that of the self-managed instance. Now, there are a couple of different ways to do this. First of all, you can manually invite all of the users into a top-level group, into your namespace, by their email address. So you can just copy and paste a bunch of email addresses, say, invite to this group with whatever permissions, whether you want guest users or developer access from the top level. Those users will then have to accept that invitation and log into gitlab.com so that you are sure that they have an existing account with the appropriate email address all set up on GitLab.com. If you have a lot of users, that might be problematic to make sure that every single one of them logs in prior to starting the migration, but it is important in order for all of that historical attributions on merge requests and issues and all that to be preserved during the migration process. Now, a second option is to set up SAML SSO and use that for authentication. Now, if you just set up standard SAML SSO, most SSO providers will allow you to create users the first time a user logs in. Right? So if someone tries to log in, there's no user account in the system. The account will be created for them. Their SAML identity will be tied to that account so that the user can now use SAML SSO for authentication. But, however, again, the same caveat applies here that then you need to make sure that all of the users actually log in via SSO prior to doing the migration so that you can guarantee that they each have user accounts on GitLab.com. You can't just create a bunch of user accounts on GitLab.com because there's no admin access to do that. Except if you're using SCIM with SAML SSO. So Okta and Azure AD both have SCIM integrations. There's a couple other SAML SSO tools out there as well. If you set up SCIM with SSO, then based on the SSO group tied to your namespace, it will automatically create accounts for all of the users in that group and remove those users once you remove them from the SAML group. And there's also SSO group sync that allows you to manage permissions at different subgroup levels as well. So with SCIM, the user accounts do get created before the user logs in. So that's an option to have the users automatically created without needing that extra login step for every user. Once you have the user set up, now you want to establish connectivity between your GitLab instances. The self-managed instance, as I said, needs to be accessible from the internet from GitLab.com. There is an IP range documented that you should put on your allow list. You may need some firewall changes to make sure that there's connectivity between GitLab.com and your self-managed instance. Once that is taken care of, you will need a personal access token created for a user that has group owner permissions or an admin user on your self-managed system that for all of the groups that are going to get migrated to GitLab.com. So if you do an admin, then they have access to everything, but you need at least group owner access for each group that you want to migrate to GitLab.com. So create a personal access token. You'll be prompted when you do the migration to use that, to enter that token in so that you can establish that connectivity back to your self-managed instance, see the groups that are available for migration, and choose one or more of those groups. In terms of the group import itself, it's pretty straightforward once you have all of that pre-work done and the admin token set up. I have some screenshots, but I'm actually going to take you through the steps live. So I have two different demo instances here. I have a self-managed instance with the URL cs.gitlabdemo.cloud, and I'm going to be using this JBurn group to migrate today. And then I have my GitLab.com instance with my top level, let's get out of there. My top level group is Julie Byrne Amazing Demo. Okay, so I'm going to migrate into this group and actually, we'll migrate into this group and then we'll do an individual project migration as well after that. So in order to do the direct transfer of the group from self-managed, I'm going to select new subgroup. And I'm going to then choose import an existing group. I don't have to give it a name because the same names of the groups that I choose on my self-managed instance will get created with the same subgroup structure and same project names as I have in my self-managed instance. So I do need to provide the URL. So my URL for my self-managed instance is cs.gitlabdemo.cloud. It's just the URL to the instance, not to a particular group that you want to migrate. And then I would paste in my personal access token. Now I had created one before. I could paste, no, I don't have it saved anymore. I could paste it in. Actually, let me go create a new one really quick just to show you how this is done. Make sure we get it all done. Here we could go and under preferences, we can look at our access tokens. We can create a new token. And we need API and read repository permissions, and then we can create a personal access token. Once we have it, we can copy it and then paste it in. And once we paste it in, we're going to connect to that self-managed instance. GitLab is going to look and see which groups I am the group owner for in that self-managed instance. And now it finds my JBurn group. If I had group ownership to multiple groups, it would show me the entire list of groups, and then I'd be able to select which ones I want to migrate. Now, on the destination side on GitLab.com, make sure you're choosing the appropriate namespace. If you have private groups that you've created, as well as your production namespace, it's going to show you the whole list. You want to make sure you're choosing the right place to migrate into. And in this case, I'm going to migrate into, I don't want the 2023 demos, so I'm just going to do Julie Byrne Amazing Demo. Oops. Okay, and it should find the appropriate set of groups that match. And I'm just looking for Amazing Demo on its own. There it is. Okay. So then I already did this migration once to test it, so I'd have to specify a new namespace in this case. But for you, you probably wouldn't already have a namespace of this, or a group of the same name already set up under your namespace, so you would just leave it as the default. I am not going to actually run this. You would select which groups you want to migrate, and then you would click to import. Since I've already done this step and it takes a few minutes, I'm not going to rerun this import. But what I will do is go back to our Julie Byrne demo. Oh, yikes, wrong place. Let me get back here. Okay. Back to my Julie Byrne Amazing Demo namespace, and now I will show you the results of the migration itself. So on my self-managed instance, you will see that I had under Julie Byrne, or JBurn group is the namespace name. I have a cloud apps subgroup, and then 3 different web apps, 1, 2, and 3. And then if I look at any web app, I can see all of its history, including things like issues and merge requests, and the full repo history is available to me. Okay, once I click that import to do the migration and I let that run, I'm going to see the same name of my group. So the group name was Julie Byrne. And then I'm going to see the same subgroup name, Cloud Apps, and the same web apps be created. And with the web apps that were created, I'm going to see all of the same history, including all the issues that were imported and the merge requests. So I have all of that available to me with all of the ownership and comments and everything intact and preserved. Okay, and so you should be able to do this with large groups with nested subgroups, many projects, multiple groups at once. This is going to be much simpler than the older way, which was export the groups first and import them, and then export and import each project individually. You don't have to worry about that anymore. You can do it all in one shot. In some cases, as I said, you might not want to import everything in a group. You might want to just export an individual project and import that project into whatever group you choose in your GitLab.com namespace. So I want to show you how to do that as well. So if we go back to our demo instance, we can look at, say, Web App 1 as an example project that we want to export and import into our GitLab.com namespace. I can go to Settings, General here, and under Advanced, I will have an option to export my project. When I do that, it's going to give me an indication that the export started and let me know that a download link will be posted on this page. And I'll also get an email with the export file once the export is finished. So I don't have to stay here and wait for this export file to be created. I can just wait for the email to come in and then grab the zip file and use it to import into my GitLab.com instance. Instead of waiting for it, I've already done this in preparation for this demo. So what I can do now is go into any subgroup that I want to. So here under my, let's go back to Julie Byrne demo. We'll do it at a different place. If I want to go into my trial migration name subgroup, I can do that. And now whichever group I want this project created in, I will just click New Project. I'm going to, in this case, create a project from a template. No, I'm not in this case. That was my mistake. Import project. And then I'm going to use a GitLab export file. Now I can give my project a name. And I can make sure that I'm choosing the appropriate group to create this project in. And in this case, I was in my trial migration subgroup, so it's going to, by default, put it there, which is fine. And then I can choose the export file that I've downloaded from my email or from the URL link that gets put on that page once the export file has been generated. Choose the appropriate zip file, click Open, and then import the project. Again, all of the historical Git data, as well as the issues and merge requests and related data, will get migrated into this project with the appropriate user associations on merge requests, comments, and owners and issue comments and all of that, as long as you have the user set up ahead of time. And then there are limitations on the UI-based project export import as well in terms of what data gets migrated. So please do read through the migration feature matrix, and see what data gets migrated or not. Okay, so we've gone through two different scenarios, one where we're exporting and importing an entire, or direct migrating an entire group and all of its subgroups and projects at once, and one scenario where we're exporting an individual project and migrating it into a subgroup of our choice. Just remember that after you do the migration, you do still need to manually recreate any additional data that was not part of the automated migration. And that includes, and this is just a subset of data, but probably the most important points to remember: registering your private runners on your GitLab.com instance, setting up any personal group and project access tokens and any deploy tokens, and any group and project level environment variables. And then also reconfiguring any integrations and any webhooks and any hard-coded URLs, whether they're in GitLab CI files or as part of GitLab webhooks, or whether they're in third-party tools like Jenkins. If you're using Jenkins for CI, you're going to need to reconfigure your Jenkins projects to point to your new GitLab project location instead of the original location on your self-managed instance. Okay, that will help ensure that you have projects that are up and running and able to be used just like they were in your self-managed instance. That's all for today. Thanks everyone for your time.